what's interesting, I think we fundamentally agree that libertarians do a pretty bad job of figuring out how to get to the destination and thinking of it as a destination, as if it were some sort of moment, like a constitutional moment or a historical moment, and then it's just going to be there. So I think that that concept is fraught for many libertarians, but also the idea that they tend to imagine the ideal, try to describe what it ought to be, and never spend a time unpacking what does it mean to actually get there given the circumstances we're in. And that's, I think you put it beautifully there. The other interesting thing is libertarians, I would like to credit Buchanan and Tulloch as being libertarians who did such a great job of helping us understand the other direction, how we tend to back ourselves, even as a relatively free constitutional republic. The founders, the American founders, one might consider at least proto-libertarians, and their first approximation at what a free society would look like in roughly after the revolution, also after 1789 with the Constitutional Convention. They had a bunch of debates. Turns out they made a great effort. They made a great republic, but they were wrong. There seems to be ways in which the original founding project has not reached full flower in the ways that the founders might have hoped. And so Buchanan and Tulloch, the sort of primary architects of public choice theory, I mean, they've had some influences, of course, but I think they're among the greatest exponents of public choice theory, basically tell us how the state tends to grow and grow, how, coupling sort of unholy alliances between special interests in the state, log rolling, all the dynamics around what causes a state to grow. And you point this out in your article. It's an incentive system that seems almost inevitable and can lead some of us to be nihilistic. So I think your call, generally speaking, for the idea of how to roll that back with a theory that is as powerful as public choice is on point, and I want to acknowledge that and grant it. But there are specific things that you today find objectionable about the way people are going about it, and let's talk about that for a little while, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I said, there are better and worse ways of rolling back the state. And another issue kind of related to this is that, my libertarianism has kind of, I guess, evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective over the years. And the way I think about things now is, I was really influenced by this thing that Steve Horowitz, the late economist, once said, which is that there's a difference between being anti-state and being pro-liberty among libertarians, right? Like, they're obviously connected. If you are at all a libertarian, you're going to recognize that states can and have and will pose serious threats to individual liberty. So if you're pro-freedom, you're going to be anti-state in some respect. But it's a question of what's fundamental to you, right? It's like, are you fundamentally against the state, or are you fundamentally in favor of human liberty? Because sometimes those things come apart. And my belief is that some of the things that states do are actually quite important and conducive to human liberty. So I've never been an anarchist. And I think that's one point on which you and I disagree. But I'm sort of increasingly attracted to this idea of state capacity and the fact that if you think that there's anything that the state ought to do, even if it's just police, courts, and military, then it's going to be really important that the states have the ability to do those things well. And simply stripping functions from the state kind of willy-nilly will, in some cases, undermine its capacity to perform whatever functions you think it ought to be performing. And obviously people are going to disagree about what those functions are, but the idea that there's some capacity there that might actually be not a threat to liberty, but actually an important prerequisite of liberty, that's something that I've come to appreciate more. And so I think it throws an extra point of caution in how we go about dismantling the state, right? Like you want to strip the functions that are bad, not the functions that are actually holding the whole machine together and performing its useful
So
function.
let's at the risk of walking away as our perhaps natural lot as theorists, try to dig down into some details. What is it that, and this is not, by the way, to conjure the debate between minarchism and anarchism. I think you might appreciate my position as being that we have to be pragmatic. We have to use Bayesian thinking and OODA loops at all times in a continuous way to be directional about freedom. And so what I call my position asymptotic anarchy. Yes, I think that it would be a very good idea for their functions of the state not to be a monopoly, but to be competitive, such that you achieve some manner of equilibrium, and the competitive nature of it, at least through some time period, assures that we have somewhere to go. The monopoly, the competitive forces mean you have a right of exit. When you have a monopoly, the monopolies tend to be problematic. Even oligopolies do, but certainly a monopoly does. There's nowhere to go. There's no competition. So it's not that I don't want to see the functions of the government, for example, policing and military and so on, go away. It's that I want to subject them to the dynamism and competitive forces of the market. And that maybe separates me in some sense from others who believe that there should simply be no state or functions of the state that are competitive. But I define anarchism in this sense as important functions that are competitive and market-based rather than monopolistic, such as violence, the use of violence, the threat of violence, and indeed the application of law. So we're not having an argument about that today. What we both acknowledge is that we want directionally to go in the same direction, which is a liberatory direction, and a direction that both enhances freedom in the sense of Horwitz, but also minimizes or reduces the amount of threats of violence in the world. It's an amount is probably the wrong way of putting it, but the level of violence and threat of violence in the world, and the preponderance or emergence of cooperation, exchange, and voluntary association that can flower in the presence of such good institutions, however we imagine them. So that leads us back into this question of specificity. What, in your mind, is a bad way to go about it? Shrinking the state? Or what are people failing to heed when they shrink the state in the wrong ways that you want people to understand?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to say about that question. I'm trying to think of what the most useful way of addressing it would be for purposes of our conversation. One thing that kind of came up in your piece that I didn't really address in mine was the case of Javier Milei in Argentina. So I laid some criticism on Doge in the United States. I didn't talk about Milei at all in my piece, but I did kind of reference the chainsaw though, right? And I said that hacking away with the state with a chainsaw probably isn't the best way of going about things. But I actually think there are some interesting and useful contrasts to be drawn between Musk and Doge in the United States and Milei's efforts in Argentina. And the short version of the story is I'm considerably more optimistic about Milei's project than I ever was about Doge here in the United States. I think there's a lot of superficial similarities between the two approaches, a lot of similarities in rhetoric, right? I mean, Milei did bring the chainsaw to the United States and handed it to Elon Musk on stage. Right. So they talk a kind of similar talk, but I think that really is a pretty superficial similarity, and that actually what Milei did and is doing and what Doge was doing are two very different projects in a lot of ways. So that might be worth exploring, right? And one sort of obvious sense in which they're different is that Millei's a libertarian, right? Millei has a long history as a libertarian economist before he ever came to wield state power. He knows, who Hayek is and who Rothbard is, and he can expound at great length and at great sophistication on their ideas. Trump is not a libertarian, right? Like by any, whatever, Angela McArdle might have said at the Libertarian Party. Like, he is not a libertarian. I don't think he's a friend to libertarians. Libertarians have kind of latched on in hopeful anticipation to some of the things that he has done. And I think some of them got very excited about Doge for that reason. But
I'm one.
Doge.
I'm one that got excited about Doge.
Yeah, I mean, I got a little excited myself at first. But I think the fact of the matter is, right, like it is, there's something foolish about expecting a libertarian project from a president who is certainly by no stretch of the imagination a libertarian, and I think in many ways quite hostile to many kind of core elements of libertarianism.